Good evening, everybody. We're just going to launch this after having our usual technical difficulties of integrating Zoom and the whole class. So thank you very much to everybody who's live for coming in tonight. There are plenty of chairs around if you can find space over there, perhaps that corner, or there's some here. People can help that. And thank you for everybody on the Zoom for joining as well. We're going to do our second talk of the series of what it means to be human, an introduction to human evolution and the human revolution. Again, with Professor Chris Knight tonight, and he's going to be talking about, is male dominance natural? So that question should lead, I hope, to a lot of discussion. Chris is a professor who taught for a long time at University of East London. He's now Senior Research Associate at University College London in this department, famous for his book, Blood Relations, Origins, Menstruation and the Origins of Culture, which might figure in this talk, whoops, plus Decoding Chomsky. So I think I'll hand over to Chris. So you want to be in that.
Okay. So yeah, great to see you all, especially that you're actually real people in the flesh, as well as, of course, slightly less real people, of course, on Zoom. Sorry?
They're not less real.
No, they're less real, but for me, they're less real because I can't see you all in 3D. And yes, we're anthropologists here. As anthropologists, we only ask one question, but it's a very big one. What does it mean to be human? Usually, if you study anthropology, you'll be expected to make a choice between social anthropology, biological anthropology, and perhaps archaeology. So you'll be asked to make a choice in addressing the question, what does it mean to be human, between the biology of being human, what does it mean to be a primate with a particular body that we have, and of course the brain and everything else that we have on our instincts. But usually if you go to a college that teaches anthropology, you won't be able to combine that with social anthropology. So as anthropologists, we address the question, what does it mean to be human, from these three different perspectives. What might it mean to be a creature that's nearly human, but not quite? For example, a chimpanzee. We're closely related, of course, to chimpanzees. Or if you're interested in the past, you might ask, what might it have meant to be a Neanderthal? Neanderthals were humans. Slightly bigger brains than ours, apparently, but they became extinct. But they were certainly humans with all the cognitive abilities, including language and the ability to produce art that we modern humans have. Of course, the standard term anthropology tends to mean social anthropology these days, and in that context, you'd be asking what are all the different ways there are of being human, socially and culturally. Now the critical point I want to make is that here at UCL, it's unusual because we do all three things. We try to connect up the dots and don't just treat humans as biological creatures or as sort of extinct creatures or as purely cultural creatures. We address the question, what does it mean to be human? In my own view, properly, amalgamating those different aspects. And of course, if you're asking what it means to be human, a pretty central question is sex and politics, and which sex is likely to be dominant. So perhaps if I ask you, how many of you think that perhaps, being realistic about things, male dominance is, after all, there is something natural about the dominance of the male over the female? How many would you be inclined to? You're allowed to put your hands up, by the way, and you're even allowed to be controversial. How many would you think that there's something natural about male dominance? Oh my God, not one of you. Actually, that's quite a relief.
That's amazing.
It's actually amazing because you are all very unusual people. I mean, I would say extraordinarily intelligent, aware.
Can you not do the lecture now then?
Sorry?
Can you not do the lecture now then?
I could just pack up, you all know the answer.
Was that the correct answer?
Sorry?
Was that the correct answer?
Well, we haven't really got to an answer, but what you've all sort of suggested to me is that contrary to prevailing opinion, you don't necessarily think that male dominance is as natural to being human as the fact we've got 4 fingers and 1 thumb on each hand. It's just one of those things, part of our genetics, part of our nature. You can't change it. You can change lots of things with legislation, social reform, maybe even revolution. But one thing you can't change is human nature. That's a widely accepted view. And I suppose you could maybe think about sports. I'm kind of being a bit devil's advocate here. But what if women are equal to men, why do we have separate women's and men's sports? Why do we have, you know, and of course, a lot of people might say, well, if women were running alongside men, they would lose. The same with boxing and the same with other physical sports. Sorry?
It depends how far.
Yes.
But would men be able to carry?
Now, I want to stress that there are some cultures that, far from thinking that male dominance is natural, they actually think the other way around. And it's actually, I would say, most pre-industrial, if you like, quote, civilized, without cities, cultures which are hunter-gatherers or horticulturalists, what you'll find is, even where there's a kind of male monopoly of ritual power, the term ritual is very important to anthropologists. Rituals are collective practices which shape awareness, shape concepts, and shape society. And in many cultures, you'll find like a men's house within which men practice their rituals and establish their dominance. And in those cultures where men kind of monopolize ritual power and exclude women from ritual power, the men have a myth. And the myth is that women have an unfair advantage over men. They have kind of magical potency, which bows and arrows, weapons can't really fight against. And I'm just going to read out one of those myths because it just illustrates the point I want to make here, which is that the Western prevailing idea, often linked with Darwinism, by the way, that male dominance stems from the fact that we've evolved from, say, chimpanzees, which are very male dominated. That's not the only way of looking at things. So this is a myth from Tierra del Fuego, the Yamana, and it's called the origin of the Kina. The Kina is this central ritual that these people had. And this is the story. In the beginning, women had sole power. They gave orders to the men, who obeyed, just as women do today. The men took care of the children, tended the fire, cleaned the skins, while the women did no work in the hut at all. That was the way it was always to be. The women invented the great Kina hut. This is the great men's house, an early version of a mosque or church or synagogue, a special house within which the men practice their rituals and from which they exert their power. The women invented the great Kina hut and everything which goes on inside it, and then fooled the men into thinking they were spirits. They stepped out of the great hut, painted all over with masks on their heads. The men did not recognize their wives, who, simulating the spirits, beat the earth with dried skins so that it shook. Their yells, howls, and roars so frightened the men that they hastened into their huts and hid, full of fear. But one day, the sun man, so often in these stories, it's the sun that takes the side of men against women who are connected with the moon. Obviously, I'm talking about mythology here. But one day, the sun man, who supplied the women spirits in the Kina hut with an abundance of game, overheard the voices of 2 girls while he was passing a lagoon. Being curious, he hid in the bushes and saw the girls washing off painting, which was characteristic of the spirits when they appeared. They had also been practicing their imitations of the voices of the spirits. Suddenly, the sun man confronted them, insisting that they reveal to him what went on in the Kina hut. Finally, they confessed to him, It is we women ourselves who paint ourselves and put on those masks. Then we step out of the hut and show ourselves to you. There are no spirits in there. It is we ourselves who yell and howl in this way to frighten you lot. So this is a story about the origin of religion, really, and religion was all a trick. And it was a trick through which women managed to scare men. Now, of course, that's one particular so-called myth of primeval matriarchy. But the interesting thing is that right across the world, wherever you have a male monopoly of ritual power, there will be a myth, often quite a sort of secret myth, but if the men want to tell you the secret, they'll tell this story. We stole these things from women. We stole this power from women. And even this hut, this great hut, the men's house, used to be a women's house within which women exerted their magical power. So women have this natural superiority, kind of unfair advantage over men. Now, the only reason I mention all that is just to say there are differences in terms of cultural belief about these questions. Our, I suppose, dominant narrative comes from Charles Darwin. And I need to stress, I am a Darwinian. I'm a scientist. I believe that we've evolved from a primate ancestor. And I also believe that we evolved from some kind of great ape. And I certainly believe that the closest relatives we have are chimpanzees of different subspecies. And it is a fact that chimpanzees are not feminists. They're not egalitarians. Actually, common chimpanzees are pretty brutally male dominated. And there are many people who argue that therefore, because we have the genes of chimpanzees, tiny, less than 1% or something like 1% difference, it's hardly surprising that given the extreme, relatively extreme male dominance of chimps, where every male in a place like, say, Gombe in Tanzania, where Jane Goodall was, where every male, even a less powerful male, will exert his dominance over every female, by kind of beating her up, really. It's hardly surprising that Darwinians, who take this theory of evolution, of course, seriously, suggest that somehow that kind of thing is part of our nature. And has anyone heard of somebody called Dale Peterson? Dale Peterson is somebody who wrote a book with Richard Wrangham called Demonic Males. And there's another Peterson called Jordan Peterson. Has anyone heard of Jordan Peterson? One or two people have heard of him. Well, he and Richard Wrangham were kind of together in a video, YouTube video, which I watched a while ago. And Jordan Peterson was quite pleased to find that Richard Wrangham seemed to be very much on his wavelength. I mean, Jordan Peterson is apparently extremely widely viewed. He says that women should just get real. Hierarchy is natural. Lobsters are very hierarchical. And we are not that closely related to lobsters, but we are fairly closely related to them. Wrangham's arguments are probably more serious because Wrangham is a very senior, authoritative primatologist, studied under Jane Goodall, studied the same chimpanzees that Jane Goodall studied. And certainly Wrangham says that the reason why males dominate among the chimpanzees is that, generally speaking, the female chimpanzees don't form alliances. They can't form alliances, but the males do form alliances, and therefore what you have is a group of females in a chimpanzee territory. The females kind of want to keep away from each other because there's not much food around. They don't want some other female, rival female, eating their food, right? And so they keep their distance from each other, whereas the males tend to patrol the whole territory as a coalition of males, and strongly dominate the females. And I suppose the point I want to make is that Richard Wrangham is a very senior primatologist with lots and lots of popular books worth reading. He says human females, women, cannot form alliances. And that's why males dominate. Women can't form alliances. I mean, he probably admits that now and again you get some kind of attempt to form alliances, but his basic position is that. Right, so what does it mean to be human? It means to be a kind of chimpanzee. Okay, there's a few people that yes, it's not fair for some people to be still outside on the door there.
We could try and put some chairs in the middle.
It is pretty amazing and wonderful to see such a fantastically full room. Brilliant, all of you. Yeah. And there are some chairs there, which I don't know if you can unstack them a bit. Completely packed this room. Luckily, we haven't got 41 people in the room. We've only got 40. 40 is the legal limit. 40. Yeah. I've counted up to 39.
And there's loads of space here. Space here.
Excuse me, Chris.
Please don't be shy.
Chris.
Sorry about the interruption. I thought it was better to do that.
Okay, so now what's astonishing about Richard Wrangham and so many other of these Darwinians who say basically we're chimpanzees is that we are just as closely related genetically to a particular species of chimpanzee called bonobos. Several decades ago, they used to be called pygmy chimpanzees because they're slightly smaller than the common chimpanzees. And I just want to say a little bit about bonobos. They're a group of chimpanzees who about 1 million years ago, we think, managed to cross from the north of the Congo River, where the chimpanzees live, to the south. Chimpanzees don't like water. They're hydrophobic. And so it was only when the Congo River pretty much dried up about 1 million years ago, now and again, very, very different periods very far apart from each other, the Congo dries up. And it looks as if one group of chimpanzees got to the south side of the Congo and they found paradise. They found an extraordinary area of marshes, wetlands, riversides, very, very abundant food. And the abundant food meant that instead of what was happening with the Gombe chimps that Wrangham studied, instead of the females having to keep apart from each other to avoid food competition, these lucky bonobos, these lucky chimps that crossed to the south side, found such abundant food that the females could forage in large groups together. And they did form alliances. And with those alliances, they did some remarkable things. Now, it's a little bit complicated to talk all about some of these issues, but what happened was, I don't know how much detail to go into, but with these bonobos, everyone now agrees that bonobos are matriarchal. The females dominate the males, and the females dominate the males because the females form coalitions, and the males tend to be kind of loners. And one of the ways in which the females form coalitions, because mostly the females who are going to be together actually aren't related, they're not sisters. They do this thing called GG rubbing. Does anyone know what GG rubbing is? Does anyone want to say in a sensible way, we'd have to be very sensible in these lectures, what GG rubbing is? Basically, if I'll say it, otherwise we're going to take too long probably. I'll just try to move quickly. What happens, two females are near each other, and there's a male nearby who might be grabbing their female's food. There might be a little duiker that they've killed. By the way, female chimps, female bonobos hunt together and kill small animals and then eat them. But there might be a male who wants that food. What the females do is they get close to each other, they sort of lean back, they open the legs, they rub their genitals together. It's called GG rubbing. They get very excited and bonded, and now they're friends and they beat up the male. And they're matriarchal. And the females, there's kind of the sophisticated theory to explain matriarchy in bonobos. It's called the offspring defense hypothesis. Because the females have got this bonding, what happens is when a male even slightly threatens a baby, like a small bonobo starts to cry because there's a big male coming near and might be threatening him. And by the way, with common chimps, there's very frequent infanticide. Males often kill babies, especially if, I mean, I won't go into all the details, but anyway, what happens here with the bonobos is that, okay, a lovely big breadfruit falls to the ground, a 2-year-old bonobo is going to start eating it, a big male is nearby, the baby starts to cry. He made a big mistake, that male. He should have been much more careful, because what will happen is the mother is always watching that baby, and she will just turn up, and suddenly all her friends will turn up, all the other females will turn up, and they'll beat up the male who's even slightly being threatening. So the offspring defense hypothesis means that the females are vigorously defending their offspring, collectively defending their offspring, and will not allow a male to threaten their babies, but they do it collectively. So what's interesting really is that we have, it's clearly Rango's right and the Darwinians are right, to say we are great apes, we are chimpanzees in a sense, but the two chimpanzees north and south of the Congo are almost like, in terms of politics, the reverse of each other, patriarchy, matriarchy. And so we have a kind of reverse dominance among the bonobos. And it just so happens that a very compelling, influential theory of our own origins is called the reverse dominance theory. It's Christopher Boehm, Hierarchy in the Forest. You can look it up. It's a lovely book. But what he says is that, yes, our great ape close relatives, ancestors, have this thing called dominance. Dominance is the ability of one animal to displace a rival. So, you know, if you're a dominant chimp, it means that in any competition of a food or shelter or whatever it is, or sex, you can displace a rival from their position by basically violence or the threat of violence. But what Boehm points out in this book, Hierarchy in the Forest, is that wherever you have dominance, you're going to get resistance. And usually the resistance among the great apes isn't too extensive. You don't get a very large coalition. The coalitions tend to be limited and temporary and sectional. But what Boehm says is that in the human case, what happened is that the resistance to dominance involved forming a coalition. And in the course of human evolution, he says these reverse dominance coalitions in resistance against alpha male dominance, they got bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually you've got what he calls a coalition of everyone. So the only thing which was dominant was the coalition, and the coalition was in resistance against the potential for anyone to dominate the group. So he has this reverse dominance. And he describes that as morality. You have a moral community when the collective dominates each individual's instincts or temptations. So you might be wanting to do something, your instincts drive you in that way, but you're soon made aware that the collective aren't too happy about this if it's going to be damaging. But the collective, the word dominance starts to be a little bit perhaps inappropriate with hunter-gatherers, because in a sense, nobody's exactly dominating except with very special ritual circumstances. But anyway, that's a theory. I should say, in introducing, again, this whole topic, going back into history, that the theory that early human kinship was matriarchal was the dominant theory in the later part of the 19th century. So I imagine some of you know this, but from the time of a book by a Swiss jurist called Berghofen, Das Mutterrecht, Mother Right, made a big impact in the middle of the 19th century. That was followed by a much more grounded, down-to-earth work by somebody called Lewis Henry Morgan, an American business lawyer who became adopted into the Iroquois tribe, and he described the people into whose culture he'd been initiated, the Iroquois, as they were the people of the longhouse. They had these big long houses, but he described them as communists, because you had a big longhouse, had a line of women down the middle. They would be in possession of the fires. They would be supported by their brothers. In marrying men would be bringing meat or other produce into the longhouse. They all get shared out among the women. And a man who was visiting the longhouse for sex, he would have to prove his worth by being hardworking and generous, particularly with, if he was a hunter, bringing in meat. And as soon as a man proved to be a bit unreliable, perhaps a bit lazy, he was out on his neck. And the women would simply say, right, off you go. And he would then go, he was fine in a way, he would go back to his mum, to another longhouse, the one he was born in, where he would have full rights in his sister's food and children and religious rights and so on. But so that became very influential, that Iroquois example. And of course, as a lot of you may know, it was taken up by Marx and Engels, who was astonished, excited to read. What they were excited about was that the Iroquois women seemed to have the kind of ownership and control over their own bodies and their own work that trade unionists could only dream of. And this became central to Marxist theory, the idea that the original form of the family wasn't the nuclear family, it wasn't the male-dominated family, it wasn't the patriarchal family, it was the matriarchal clan. But in the later part of the 19th century, just about everybody, all the experts, if you like, agreed with that basic idea. And there were quite compelling reasons for it. For example, looking around the world, very many cultures that hadn't developed city life, urban life, tended to be matrilineal, very often matrilocal. A woman would never leave her mum on getting married. She'd stay with her mum and a kin, and the husband would be a visitor. Matrilocal residence was very frequent, particularly among gardening horticultural people. Obviously, if a woman's living with her mum, she's going to be living with her sisters, and she's going to have a lot of solidarity, and the visiting husband won't have the same kinship backing. And so matrilocal residence doesn't exactly mean matriarchy, but it's certainly likely to add to the status of women, compared with when a woman has to leave her family on getting married and then lives with her husband and his kin and his mother, isolated and without her relatives. So there were, and then of course, one other very important reason why it was taken in the late 19th century that this form, matrilineal descent, was original, was because it was extremely unusual to see any patrilineal society move to being matrilineal, whereas matrilineal societies moving towards patrilineal for different reasons, development of farming, ownership of cattle, was happening all over the place. You could see so many matrilineal societies becoming patrilineal, but very few societies which are patrilineal becoming matrilineal. I think what I just mentioned, by the way, a critical point. I just met Ruth Mace outside here just now. She's written a lovely piece on the fact, exactly this topic, explaining that male dominance isn't natural. She makes the point that across the middle of Africa, there's what's called the matrilineal belt. And that's just so interesting, because the matrilineal belt is an area where you have many of these Bantu societies are matrilineal. And the reason is because of the tsetse fly, the fly that gets into the cattle and kills the cattle eventually by laying their eggs inside the cattle's skin and flesh. And what happens is, what happens is that the original system seems to have been one where, certainly with hunter-gatherers, a man would never gain conjugal rights in a woman. So you had what was called bride service. Hunter-gatherers, what's called immediate return hunter-gatherers that don't practice storage. Invariably, the basic economic system is called bride service. And it means that a man has to move out from his camp, has to visit his sweetheart in her camp, and he has to do bride service for her, which means he will never own the woman. He will never be able to say, I've got conjugal rights in you. There's never a wedding, for example. He has to provide, if he's a hunter, he has to provide meat. But then what began to happen in a much later period of history was the development of cattle ownership, which meant that a man could turn up to a village where a woman was, and he could present the girls that he fancied, could present her parents, her relatives. He could say, right, I've got 20 cattle, maybe 30 cattle. That's kind of a lifetime's hunting labor. Can I just take, if I give you all these cattle, can I take the woman away to my place? And that's called lobola. I'm simplifying a bit, but that's kind of the essence of it all. But then what happens, supposing that the man has given a whole lot of cattle to a woman's relatives in order to take the woman away to his own camp and have children by her, and the children would then take his family name and be descended from him within his lineage. Supposing the cattle die because of the tsetse fly, well, what happens is the women that this woman who's moved came to the women who've received the cattle, and the men, by the way, and the brothers, they say, well, it's nice getting the cattle, but they've all died. Can we have our woman back? And so wherever the tsetse fly spread, what would happen was that a patrilineal society would revert to being matrilineal, owing to the fact that the cattle could no longer be used to practice lobola. A point that, as I say, in this very nice recent article by Ruth Maces, kind of makes the point. So, okay, so anyway, many arguments for this idea that matrilineal descent preceded patrilineal descent. So you might ask, why the change? What happened to turn the tide against that theory of early human matriarchy? And I'm just reading out from my book here, but I'm just reading from, I'm going to be quoting from a pamphlet, which is a recording of a radio broadcast, a debate between Bronislaw Malinowski and Robert Grifo. Robert Grifo was one of the last in the old tradition, 19th century tradition really, of arguing that early human kinship was matrilineal. Malinowski, who of course taught down the road at the LSE, Bronislaw Malinowski, he's kind of the founding father of professional academic anthropology. He's kind of where we all come from in institutional terms, so absolutely central figure. And so I'm just writing here that, okay, Malinowski repeated on many occasions, quote, that the tradition of individual marriage and the family has its roots in the deepest needs of human nature and of social order, seeing it as his professional task to, quote, prove to the best of my ability that marriage and the family have been, are, and will remain the foundations of human society. So whereas previous authorities would lead us to believe, quote, that what I like to call the initial situation of kinship is not individual but communal, Malinowski said, no, on the contrary. The family and marriage from the beginning were individual. Culture's initial situation was dominated by, quote, the group consisting of father and mother and their children, forming a joint household, cooperating economically, legally united by a contract, and surrounded by religious sanctions which make the family into a moral unit. So he's arguing that the marital bond, a man having conjugal rights in a woman, if you like, the nuclear family, is the fundamental building block of all human societies and is the initial form of the family. So you might, and many people do think that Malinowski was kind of being academically dispassionate and scientific, but I want to just read out from you the words in which he denounced what he termed the group motherhood theory. Perhaps before I read this quote out, I just want to stress that nowadays, all of us in biological anthropology, pretty much all of us, there are obviously the debates and everything, now agree with the position of a very senior theorist, Sarah Hrdy, one of the founders of selfish gene Darwinism. Selfish genes just means genes replicate self, nothing to do with selfishness, I must say. But anyway, Sarah Hrdy was probably the founder of this modern version of Darwinism, and the only one of the founders, unlike Richard Dawkins and so many others, whose specialism was primates, was humans. So she's convinced the community really that we became human on the basis of what she calls alloparenting, group parenthood. Evolving human females could not possibly have afforded to look after the kinds of babies that we humans are, large brains, slow developing, if they'd been single mums. And she also discusses the way in which this collective parenting between whole groups of women of each other's children generates the kind of consciousness, cognitive sophistication, self-awareness that marks out humans. So what I'm saying is the group motherhood theory is the dominant theory these days. It's kind of science. If you want to check it out, just read Mothers and Others by Sarah Hrdy, a wonderful, wonderful book. But here we have Malinowski, the founder of my discipline. I believe that the most disruptive element in the modern revolutionary tendencies is the idea that parenthood can be made collective. If once we came to the point of doing away with the individual family as a pivotal element of our society, we should be faced with a social catastrophe compared with which the political upheavals of the French Revolution and the economic changes of Bolshevism are insignificant. The question, therefore, as to whether group motherhood is an institution which ever existed, whether it is an arrangement which is compatible with human nature and social order, is of considerable practical interest. In the light of all that, he came to declare that classificatory kinship terminologies do not exist and never could have existed. Now, classificatory kinship is a kind of kinship that hunter-gatherers and other horticultural people have. Which means that the word mother, if a child says my mother's not well, there's a whole category of mothers, a whole class of mothers who are your mothers in terms of terminology, obviously clearly reflecting this collectivism that's so characteristic of hunter-gatherers and other societies. And so he says that classificatory terminologies do not exist, never could have existed. I mean, what he's saying is really, if anyone says that this person is my mother, and that person that you call your mother didn't actually give birth to you, it can't be biologically true, and therefore it can't be actually true. Nobody can have more than one mother. Of course, biologically, that's true, but mothering, of course, is a social and cultural caring thing, and it's perfectly possible for a woman to say about her sister child, my sister's child is my child. I will treat my sister's child as if it was mine, which is the kind of logic underlying this kind of kinship, by the way, which is, is far more characteristic of hunter-gatherers and horticultural societies than the kind of individualistic kinship that we have in our society. So anyway, I'm just saying, if you want to know why it is that the theory of primitive matriarchy went out of fashion, you can see that as far as Malinowski is concerned, who was the decisive figure, politics wasn't far from his mind. He thought that any idea that you could have collective childcare would lead to feminism. And it might even lead to something even worse. It might even lead to some kind of socialism. So it had to be stamped on.
What's that? What was that last bit?
Well, it had to be stamped on. You would have to stamp on ideas which are subversive of the patriarchal social order. And it's perhaps worth mentioning as well, another very senior figure in evolutionary anthropology. Her name is Christian Hawkes. And again, it would take too long to go into too much detail, but she explains, she's the author of what's called the grandmothering hypothesis. And that explains the development of menopause in the human female. So whereas other primates, other great apes, the female tends to die not too long after her cycling stops. In the human case, of course, you go on living for several decades. And without getting into too much detail, Christian Hawkes says the critical thing is that women can, if they live longer without reproducing, it's actually going to be beneficial for the children, because it's quite dangerous if you depend on your mum and she dies. So it's actually better for women to be in their later years looking after their daughter's children or their grandchildren. That's the grandmother hypothesis. But the critical point is that theory of grandmothering, which is again very persuasive, compelling, almost part of the consensus. There's always arguments about everything really, but it's certainly not a marginal theory. It really only works with matrilineal, because only the genetics of the idea that looking after your grandchildren is a way of enhancing your fitness better than having your own children in your later years. The genetics only works in the female line, because of course, in genetic terms, you're sure of your daughter's children being yours. You can't be sure of your son's children being yours. So that's another reason, in addition to Sarah Herdy's arguments, why in fact matrilineal kinship, matrilineal descent seems to be part of our evolution in the way that patrilineal isn't. And I should just add one more thing. We were all in the radical anthropology group in Liverpool for a conference of hunting and gathering societies, and we had a bunch of geneticists who were using modern methods of genetics, with hunter-gathering peoples and farming peoples in Africa. And again, it's quite a bit of a long argument, but they were able to show that women in Africa, if they were hunter-gatherer women, were living with them down the generations, whereas men were moving out. And the sign of that was that the particular genetic sequences that's transmitted down the female line through the called mitochondrial DNA were clustered in localities, showing that women had been living in roughly the same area down through the generations, whereas men's nuclear DNA, Y chromosome DNA, was dispersed. The opposite pattern from farmers, where because women had to move out and getting married, men tended to stay put. It was the nuclear DNA which was clustered in patterns. What does that mean? What it means is that for hunter-gatherers in Africa, where we evolved, where we all came from Africa, it tends to support the argument that there's some deep reason why hunter-gatherers practice matrilocal residence. Women tend to live with mum. Clearly, the reason is because if you're living with mum, you can benefit from your mum's experience in childbirth, in breastfeeding, and all those things which women need. Living with your mother-in-law isn't so helpful. And these geneticists were showing, not really, they weren't able to show that living with mum went right back into the evolutionary past, but it does seem as if matrilocal residence stretched back thousands of years in Africa. Again, confirming the idea that matrilocal residence is an ancient pattern, and where residence is matrilocal, descent tends to be matrilineal. Now, what I've been talking about, Chris Hawkes and Sarah Hurdy, in some ways, all these very exciting scientific findings, they've been happening kind of under the radar. And as far as I can work out, it's sort of under the radar precisely because Sarah Hurdy, Chris Hawkes, and these other pioneers have been working with selfish gene Darwinism. And selfish gene Darwinism has always been kind of perceived as slightly worrying by cultural theorists who think that selfish genes mean humans are selfish because we've got genes, and don't read the actual book, The Selfish Gene. Genes have to replicate themselves, otherwise they're not around. But how they replicate themselves and what kind of behavior is compatible with the proteins that the genes produce is, of course, a completely different matter. So, it's perfectly possible, as in social insects like bees, for selfish genes to produce extraordinary levels of altruistic behavior in the actual individuals. So now I wanted to move on a little bit, still talking about history, because we're asking whether male dominance is natural, which is sort of the same question as whether matriarchal societies are possible. And I'm just going to take a few quotes here from this book, David Graeber and David Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. Quite a few of us in the radical anthropology group are a little bit unhappy with actually very, very unhappy with quite a lot of this book, but parts of it are very interesting and well said. And these chapters are from, in which we discuss how Çatalhöyük, the world's oldest town, got a new history. And they're talking about this place located on the Konya plain of central Turkey. Çatalhöyük was first settled around 7,400 BC, and obviously it'll take too long to go into it all, but what they're saying is that they're talking about Çatalhöyük's remarkable material culture, clay figurines of seated women, including a famous example flanked by felines. Last week, actually, I talked about the royal coat of arms, the heraldic woman, the sort of round circle, a kind of womb sign with a lion on one side and a unicorn on another. That's the heraldic female, an example of which is found in Çatalhöyük. So you have this kind of goddess-like figure flanked by dangerous animals, one on either side of her. And so they're saying these were understood as depictions of a mother goddess presiding over the fertility of women and crops. Today, they say, most archaeologists consider it deeply unsound to interpret prehistoric images of corpulent women as fertility goddesses. The very idea that they should be is the result of a long outmoded Victorian fantasies about primitive matriarchy. So they kind of go on to say that this whole theory of primitive matriarchy is for about a century actually being considered is like completely wrong. Anyone who even mentions it is obviously, deluded. And nobody now, these authors are saying, interprets those Venus figurines as goddess representations. But so it's hardly surprising that the topic of primitive matriarchy became something of an embarrassment, the intellectual equivalent of a no-go zone for subsequent generations. And they say hardly surprising because the evidence, was quite shaky in many ways. I mean, just because you've got a goddess figurine, does that mean that women would really, that they really have real power in real life? And then they come, this is the interesting bit, but it's hard to avoid the impression that something else is going on here. The degree of erasure has been extraordinary and far more than is warranted by mere suspicion of an overstated or outdated theory. Among academics today, belief in primitive matriarchy is treated as a kind of intellectual offense, almost on a par with scientific racism, and its exponents have been written out of history. Okay, and so, and of course they're right. They're trying to say there seems to be some absolute horror, frenzied denunciation of the very idea that women could rule over men under any circumstances. But then later in the book, Graeber and Wengrow, they talk about Minoan Crete, and they talk about the artistic depictions on walls. And it has Bronze Age Crete. Okay. By far the most frequent depictions of authority figures in Minoan art show adult women in boldly patterned skirts that extend over their shoulders but are open at the chest. Women are regularly depicted at a larger scale than men, a sign of political superiority in the visual traditions of all neighboring lands. They hold the symbols of command, like the staff-wielding Mother of Mountains, who appears on a seal impression from a major shrine at Knossos. They perform fertility rites before horned altars, sit on thrones, and meet together in assemblies with no male presiding, and appear flanked by supernatural creatures and dangerous animals. That's like the Lion and the Unicorn. Most male depictions, on the other hand, are either of scantily clad or naked athletes. No women are depicted naked in Minoan art, or show men bringing tribute and adopting poses of subservience before female dignitaries. Now, all that's true. And I think quite convincingly, these authors are saying, well, we need to find all the depictions seeming to indicate that if we want to have authority, you better be a woman. And men are going to be subordinate just because they're men. I mean, all right, maybe the idea of full matriarchal rule as a kind of mirror image of patriarchal rule is a bit unrealistic. My own view is that I don't think women would ever want to do that. I think when women have got power, they don't really want to replicate what men do to women when they have power. But still, they're making a very genuine and important point. Why is even to mention the possibility of matriarchy considered so I don't know, so utterly unacceptable? One of the I learnt my anthropology here at UCL, and one of my teachers was Mary Douglas. Some of you will have heard of her. She was, in her time in the 80s, regarded as kind of the English equivalent, British equivalent of Claude Lévi-Strauss. She was like a massively significant figure, and I tend to agree. I think she should be seen in that light. Extraordinary, imaginative writer who'd done work in Africa with the matrilineal people, the Lely of the Kasai. But what I'm just concentrating on here is a wonderful article she wrote. You'll easily be able to Google it, I think, and find it. It's called "Is Matrilineal Doomed in Africa?" And what she argues is this, that when you have matrilineal descent, a man has to move to and fro between two localities, okay? Because with matrilineal descent, a man sort of lives with his sister, has his children are his sister's children, his rights are in that his sister's village or camp, but of course he might want sex. Okay, he's got to go somewhere else and visit his wife, where he won't have rights, but if he behaves himself and is useful, he might get sex, but kind of conditionally, he will never get conjugal rights. So that means the men go crisscross, 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 to and fro, to and fro, to and fro. A man can't do what you can do on the patrilocal system. A man can't just have his children, his wife, his his property, all in one place. So what Mary Douglas is saying is that if in a society, the people value their relationships as their major form of wealth, over and above property, which can be inherited or stored. If the relationships are most important, if your wealth is your wealth in other people, then it makes sense to have matrimony, because you're going to have all kinds of relationships and everyone's going to be connected up with everyone else. And critically, no borders, because everything's crisscrossing. As soon as you get property, maybe some farming, maybe having to put a fence up to protect your crops, having borders, a man then has all of his rights in one place, then things are going to change substantially, and matrimony kind of won't work. And what Mary Douglas, she's kind of hoping that in Africa, maybe you would have circumstances under which matrimony would come back into prevalence because of its value in connecting up people across vast areas of landscape. I mean, of course, we know that it didn't happen. And I'm getting near the end of this. How much time have I got?
50 minutes.
50. I probably need about 12 minutes more. Okay, now I was baptized into the ideas I put in my book, Blood Relations, here in UCL, again, by Mary Douglas. And what happened was that I attended a lecture of hers. And the lecture was it was on a book by somebody called Hobin, Ian Hobin. It's called The Island of Menstruating Men. So the Wagos hunter's technique of male menstruation involves wading out to the sea with a crayfish or crab's claw until the water is up to the man's knees. I'm quoting from the book, The Island of Menstruating Men. This is Papua New Guinea. Perhaps I should be introduced a little bit better than that. What happens is that now and again, a man might feel, I'm feeling a bit tired, a bit lethargic, I haven't seen so much energy. What's been going wrong? Probably I've been having too much sex. I've been too close to women. I need to keep away from women. I need to do a sort of, the word sex drive doesn't appear here, but keeping apart from women, not losing my semen, keeping it in me, maybe it's going to make me a bit more strong. And of course, we all know, don't we, about boxers and sportsmen. You mustn't have sex on the night before the big match, all that stuff, because it might weaken you a bit. They're still around, that idea. So what these men would do was that they'd menstruate. And of course, it's not very easy for a man to menstruate, but where there's a will, there's a way. You can do all sorts of different ways. You can breathe through the nose, you can cut your ear. And here, what the man would do, he waded to the sea and take a crayfish or crab's claw. I won't gesticulate at it because it'd be a bit inappropriate. But all I can say is that when Mary Douglas was reading this out, I was just crossing my legs. It was really difficult because she was describing how a man would go to the water's edge, pull up his penis, stick the claw of the crab into the underside, poke it through there, and rip it up through the, and up and down until all the water was red. I'll just read that out. He stands there with legs apart and induces an erection. When ready, he pushes back the foreskin and hacks at the glands, first on the left side, then on the right. Above all, he must not allow the blood to fall on his fingers or his legs. He waits until the cut has begun to dry and the sea is no longer pink, and then walks ashore. The man then wraps his penis in leaves, returns to the men's house and stays there for 2 or 3 days, sexual intercourse being prohibited until the appearance of the next new moon. And again, I mean, I've said I was sort of baptized into lots of thinking by this lecture that Mary Douglas gave, and you might think, okay, why am I here? Why am I even talking about menstruation, the precipice? And the reason is as follows. Just think about it in our own culture, but so many others. Deep down. Why would it be inappropriate for women to be, say, airline pilots? Why would it be, why are there certain things which women really best if they don't do? And I think we know, women have moods, they have their ups and downs, they have their hormones, they have their, they have their, and so what I'm trying to argue here is that is that we have this paradoxical fact that across so many cultures, men have this belief that in order to be really powerful and really strong, the best thing to do is to menstruate. And yet somehow it's a complete double standards. Women's menstruation is interpreted as exactly the opposite way. It's the reason why women need to be sort of kept in place. So where's it? 510. I think I mentioned Claude Lévi-Strauss. Claude Lévi-Strauss was the sort of dominant figure in anthropology at the time when I was becoming an anthropologist in the 70s. Everyone was so excited because it seemed as if Claude Lévi-Strauss was kind of making the study of kinship, ritual, mythology like a proper science. And in particular, he was able to show that scientific law, scientific regularity applied even to the areas of human life which might seem least subject to any kind of constraints or laws. Take a story, imagine a story of this. In a myth, anything can happen. You can die and come alive again. You can jump over a cliff and go upwards instead of downwards because it's a story. So what Lévi-Strauss was arguing was that if even in the realm of myth, you could find scientific constraints, almost like natural laws, then you made a real point about the applicability of science and the way in which anthropology can join up with the natural sciences in being truly scientific. But of relevance to this evening's talk is how he describes what the message of all these myths. He said he studied 1,000 myths of North and South America. He could easily have extended it to Australia and Europe, but it's a limit to what you can do. So he kept to the Americas. But in these lines, he described why the myths are there and what their message is. And he says that in the final analysis, they're all variations on the rule of women theme. I started out this talk with the story of the rule of women, the origin of the Kina, the women in this menstrual house having this terrifying power, fooling the men with all their screams and shouts, and the master wearing a kind of trick against the men. But Lévi-Strauss is saying all the myths of North and South America are variations on that basic theme. As he puts it, the veil lifts to reveal a vast mythological system common to both South and North America, and in which the subjection of women is the basis of the social order. We can now understand the reason for this. So what is this reason why women must be subjected? So powerful are women's flows and so demanding of cosmic synchrony that unless carefully controlled, they could throw the whole universe into chaos. So these are Lévi-Strauss's words, having touched on the dangers of cycles which are too slow or too fast. The reason why women are most in need of education, that means education by men, of course, is that they are periodic creatures. Because of this, they are perpetually threatened in the whole world with and through them by the two possibilities that have just been mentioned. A periodic rhythm could slow down and halt the flow of events, or it could accelerate and plunge the world into chaos. It is equally conceivable that women might cease to menstruate and bear children, or that they might bleed continuously and give birth haphazardly. But in either case, the sun and the moon, the heavenly bodies, governing the alternation of day and night and of the seasons, would no longer be able to fulfill their function. Earliest womankind, according to all these myths, simply could not be trusted to menstruate or give birth on time. In her pristine innocence, she did not have monthly periods and gave birth suddenly and without warning. And this, according to Lévi-Strauss, was a kind of denial of culture. Culture has to be dominant over nature. Somehow, women's nature needs to be subordinated to culture, and culture is the realm of what men produce. And I'll just, this quote. So, it is as periodic creatures that women are in danger of disrupting the orderly working of the universe. Their social insubordination, often referred to in the myths, is an anticipation in the form of the rule of women of the infinitely more serious danger of their physiological insubordination. Therefore, women have to be subjected to regula, and the rules instilled into them by their upbringing, like those imposed on them, even at the cost of their subjection by a social order willed and evolved by men, are the pledge and symbol of other rules, a bit of a long sentence this, the physiological nature of which bears witness to the correspondence between social and cosmic rhythm. So really what Levi-Strauss is doing there is accepting the face value message of the stories, which is that the reason women are dangerous is because they have menstrual cycles, and these menstrual cycles ought to be synchronized with each other and with the moon, so that everything's on earth as it is in heaven, as it were. Everything ought to be cosmically harmonious. And so he's saying basically that menstrual synchrony was invented by men. And I just remember when I was listening to Mary Douglas's talk, because she didn't just talk about the island of menstruating men, she talked about so many other areas where men claim to give birth, claim to menstruate. When they do menstruate, they do it all properly. They all do it. They all bleed together by the ears or the penis or whatever it is they bleed. And I just thought, it cannot be that this way of being powerful through shedding blood together in synchrony with the moon, it cannot really be that men invented this. Surely menstrual synchrony, if it was invented, if it was part of the origins of culture, must have been something which women achieved. And I'll just, I suppose, end by saying, it's a little bit of another sort of issue, but it is a fact that the human female menstrual cycle is sort of unusual. Chimpanzees have a 36-day cycle. The bonobos I mentioned earlier have a 40-day cycle. The human female menstrual cycle, on average, and we now have lovely menstrual apps which give us thousands and thousands of cycles all properly treated. The human menstrual cycle, when it's given the proper statistical treatment, the average comes out at 29.5 days. Well, I'm always told, oh, Chris, don't worry about it. It's just a coincidence. And I'm always thinking, and I say this to everybody, yeah, I agree, it could be just a coincidence. But before dismissing it as a coincidence, why not explore whether there might not have been some adaptive reason why women would have benefited from synchronizing with each other using the moon as a clock? Have you thought of that? Well, in RAG, we and yet, of course, everybody knows that, okay, it's true that it's important to have the right to work, but it's on the other hand, unlike men, women have babies and, I kind of have to have some time off, and there's all these tensions. But with the kind of people that my colleague, who probably was Jerome Lewis, who opened the door for you, because he had to go off, but he works here, of course. The kind of people that he's worked with over many, many years, the Benjeli, the people of the so-called pygmy people of the part of the Congo, where for those people, home is a collective home, because the nuclear family is the basis of everything. Home is where everything happens. Home is where the power is. Home is where the stories are told. Home is where all the produce comes back. Home is where to be if you want to have some status and power. So in those societies, unlike with us, where we think, oh, obviously, if you're giving birth, if you have a menstrual cycle, if you're breastfeeding, it's going to take you away from society. It's going to isolate you from the world, because you're at home, and home, we all assume, of course, home is going to be an isolated place, maybe some tower block, I don't know, isolated from everybody. But in the kinds of societies which we evolve within, hunter-gatherer societies with extended kinship, substantial amount of map to local residence as women's initial choice of where to live with mum. Home is where the power is. And men, when they have to go out, hunting, okay, men like hunting, but there's not a lot of social power to be gained in that. The power comes from coming back into the home, being celebrated maybe as a brave hunter if you're a man, generous hunter, obviously a modest hunter particularly, and critically, in those societies, particularly, Jerome, I think we'll be talking about this, it's laughter, the ability to laugh at anyone who gets above themselves, which brings everyone down, makes sure everything's harmonious, singing, polyphonic singing, laughter, particularly women's laughter, which is the main leveling device. So in those societies, women's place being the home has a different meaning. it's like saying women's place is where the power is. And then you have that power, but not despite being female, not despite having cycles and reproductive organs that can produce babies and feed them afterwards. Not despite being female, but because of being female. Okay, thank you.
Very much, Chris. And so I'm sure there's lots of questions. Chris covered a lot of ground in that talk. I'm sure there's lots of questions. I'm going to take a couple in the room first and then see if our Zoom audience wants to as well. In fact, we could put the Zoom people up on here. Anybody like, got one down there of that?
Just wondering, so semantically, natural to me, way things we talk about, but also way things should be. I'm wondering if we can deduce from that the things that natural cycle is almost an evolutionary requirement for us to first the great sea name. And we then say that's also how it should have been. So what I'm trying to ask is, if we were patronized from the original trying to first the great sea name, would it have been hypothetically plausible? Still would be
Right.
So
can we repeat? Did people hear that?
I think the argument is, so what? Maybe distorting a bit, correct me, but I think you're sort of saying, so what if matrilineal kinship, matrilocal residence, collective childcare was the original form? Why would that mean that we ought to work like that today? Surely, if supposing we found the opposite, we found that patriarchy, nuclear family, scientifically was the way we originated, would that mean that politically we would be advocating patriarchy today? Is that something like what you're saying?
Yeah, essentially.
Yeah, okay, essentially. Well, it's a question of what things make us fulfilled? What things make us feel that life has a meaning? What kind of instincts have we that we want to make our society sort of compatible with? So I would say, my own view is that we feel happiest as humans when we are with our equals, when we can laugh with people, when we're with our mates. And it's difficult to laugh with your boss. I think mostly it's difficult to laugh when you try to boss other people around, all sorts of tensions, all sorts of difficulties. So the evolutionary psychological sort of view is that there's a thing called the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. What kind of social world, social circumstances are we best adapted to? We have this thing called laughter, which is a rather remarkable, species-specific signal. And my own view is that to advocate a kind of society that runs against our deepest instincts would be a bit strange. And my own view is that actually capitalism does largely, because it's huge. I mean, when you have to constantly worry about roof over your head, paying the rent, paying the mortgage, where does your next meal come from, and also all the status competition that goes on, we suffer from a lot of anxiety and tension. And Jerome tells me that the majority just don't have any of that. So I think it makes a lot of sense to say we should try to arrange our society in such a way that our nature is validated. I think there is such a thing as human nature, by the way. Of course, obviously that comes from what I've been saying all along. Essentially, we do have instincts, and it's a kind of a bit of a mistake if we produce a social order which runs against all our deepest distinctively human instincts.
Is that an okay answer for the question? You were asking a lot of technical things about the grey ceiling and so on, which I'll try and talk about more next week. But yeah,
I always thought it came off. I don't know where, so I don't know that stuff. But it's been proven, isn't it, through science, that the grandmother, when she's forming in her mother's, the fact that when, I don't know how to explain it, the eggs inside my daughter were formed inside my mother's body.
mm-hmm.
And that, to me, is the link in matriarchy. And that's why a lot of friends and grandparents and stuff like that I know have said, maybe that's why the grandmothers get on better with the grandkids. And they seem to get along better bringing them up and taking them to school and dropping them off and all that sort of business. Just as something practical that I've observed. But I can't explain all the sciencey names and numbers and all that stuff. But it is apparently it's been proven scientifically now. So really, the eggs that produced my daughter came from my grandmother. They were formed in her body, and the eggs,
Your grandmother or your mother?
my grandmother.
The thing is about,
No, mum, no.
yeah, but can I just,
Well, no, we
well,
both
I
his
know.
grandmother. My mother.
the thing is that, the
grandmother.
thing is what you've just said, whether it's true or not.
Grandmothers are
Yeah, but can I just kind of,
apparently scientifically.
I'm sure it's scientifically proven, but the trouble is it's scientifically proven for all mammals, you see. So, I mean,
Yeah, but
and
still, it's something.
okay,
that
but I'm
we've
just
been
giving you
brought
my
up to
answer.
believe that,
My answer is that
the seed
that
comes from man,
doesn't mean
and
that
that's not true.
anything about matrilineal or matriarchy, because chimpanzees, common chimps, which are very male dominated and sexist, if you like, and horrible lots of.
A lot of women are like that too.
Yes, I know, but I'm trying to give my answer.
Oh, okay.
So it's all right, as you asked the question. And so I don't think the fact that your eggs, even if that is true, that the eggs are the same with your grandmothers and that's just a biological fact, which as far as I know, if it's true, would apply to mammals in general, certainly to primates in general.
But
It doesn't pick out, it doesn't pick out anything.
connection
It doesn't pick out
between
anything.
humans and
It does
women.
not pick out anything political.
Right. And I mean, there are important things that are being found
I
out
just thought
about.
I'd throw it in.
There are
I'm not
important
objecting, you throw it in. I'm not
things that are being found out about what's known as epigenetic transmission, which is what this is discussing. And it's a whole opening area
And it will
of
change how we perceive
evolutionary biology.
patriarchy and
Possibly
matriarchy, according to me
so.
anyway. Because it's changed how
Yes,
I view
okay,
it.
shall we have another question?
Have we got any more in the room? Otherwise, I'm going to ask Zoom people. If there's anybody on Zoom who wants to raise hand or ask anything. Any more? Don't be shy.
You don't
Please
have-
don't be
By
shy.
the way, this is all quite controversial. stuff.
Controversial.
I mean, it's, our team have been around for quite a while, but I mean, it's still, I can't claim this is mainstream. It's kind of in some ways mainstream. A lot of it, the Sarah Hurdy stuff is definitely mainstream and stuff. But I mean, you've every right to be critical and questioning.
Many feminist anthropologists are highly dismissive of the sort of matriarchy stories that Chris was reading out, saying, well, these aren't true stories, they're not literal stories, they're stories which are justifications for men to be dominant over women and do those things that they do to women. So they're kind of charters for male dominance. So that could be perceived as a weak link of the argument. But yeah, over there.
I'm not an anthropologist, so certainly not speaking any knowledge.
Good. That's great. That's an advantage, probably.
Thank you for your lecture. I enjoyed it a lot. I read the Raingrove and Gray book, and I've been hearing a lot from sort of friends who know more about it having lots of problems. But I was wondering how their view about societies altering seasonally. I mean, if that's even a view that isn't completely controversial, how that interacts with this. Is it possible that societies go in and out of being patrilineal and matrilineal seasonally?
It's a lovely question. Can I repeat the question for the Zoom people? A really important question coming from the book, The Dawn of Everything, where they argue that there were sort of kings in the Upper Paleolithic, in the Ice Age, kings, who knows, not quite the right word necessarily, but very senior, privileged, special people with very spectacular burials. But what they say is that, and I love this idea, is that in that period, some of that period, people love to erect social hierarchy in order to have the pleasure of bringing that hierarchy down and then letting it rise up again in order to once again having the revolutionary pleasure of bringing it all crashing down. And I was with David, who was in my flat many years ago, I think it was 2014 or something like that, when we were discussing all this. And I remember saying to David, well, that's actually the same theory we've got, which our colleague in RAG, Morna Finnegan, described as communism in motion. So now the critical thing here is that Graeber and Wenger are basing their idea of a seasonal alternation between hierarchy and egalitarianism, or perhaps between matriarchy and patriarchy. They're basing that on a wonderful work called Seasonal Variations of the Eskimo, where a particular description of Eskimo people, Inuit people, was that they had a kind of communism in the winter, and then on a certain day in spring, the town cry goes around ringing a bell, and everyone switches over to kind of patriarchy. So a man would be with his wife and with three or four wives in a patriarchal arrangement through the summer, and then in the winter, everyone switches into not exactly matriarchy, but certainly some kind of communism, including even sexual communism. So they have a great fun sort of switching between these phases of kinship structure or family life. And our argument, which I remember discussing with David, because he's a great friend of mine, was yes, but we evolved in Africa. And in Africa, the seasons don't take the same form. The moon's more important. We evolved in close association with lions. Lions have superb night vision. They like hunting you and eating you when you're traveling around at night with no moon. And then there were all sorts of reasons for thinking that the menstrual cycle linked in with these rhythms. And we had something like what you're saying, something like matriarchy from new moon to full moon. Full moon, let's switch over, have a bit of patriarchy. Don't let the patriarchs go too far. Make sure they're all overthrown next dark moon, and you have this switch over and switch over. And Morna Finnegan's been pretty convincing in interpreting what Jerome Lewis, who teaches here, describes as the ritual structures of the Benjeli, where you have a women's ritual called Ngoku, where the women take over, but the women can almost they have power for several days. And we could even show a video, perhaps, if we get time, or maybe we're going to show it next week, of Ngoku, where the women just invade the men's space, incredibly provocative, very, very sexy, using their sexuality as sort of weaponry to intimidate the men. And the men are all kind of a bit shy and a bit embarrassed, but the women get fed up with being on top, and they sort of like, okay, we've had enough, we've made our point. And the men are okay about it, and they say in the film, well, we're going to have our turn. And then the men have a jengi, when they strut around with all their power. And that Morna says this could get dangerous if the men doing a jengi did it for too long and outside they're welcome. But what happens is that the ajengi, because it can be a little bit potentially threatening, it provokes the women into responding with their Ngoku. So you get kind of women's rule, men's rule, women's rule, men's rule, and everyone's happy. To me, that is just paradise. That's it. That's how we should all be. Instead of having one sex dominating all the time in a fixed way, it's much better to have a sort of a seesaw process. Something, and it's so interesting in this book, precisely the question they're asking is, how did we get stuck? How did things get fixed? It's a superb question. I think their answers are very weak. I think we got stuck when we lost touch with the moon, but that's a whole nother story.
And just imagine if we could do that with the bankers.
Yeah. Just bring them all down. If they want to play big bankers with their funny little schemes and things, let them play for 2 weeks and then have a great pleasure of another anti-capitalist revolution, and it may be quite useful. They may even be able to do some useful things if we don't let them take the piss.
And questions on Zoom. Lucky, you wanted to ask a question. Do you want to unmute?
Yes. Well, first, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Camilla.
We can't hear you. Can't hear you.
Yes.
I can.
Can't hear.
I can hear.
Oh, somebody can.
Yeah.
You can hear me.
Let's put it in the chat then. Put your question in the chat. Have I got there? Is the sound loud on here? Have we done it loud?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Lucky, do it again. Say it again. It's your fault. Can you ask the question again?
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So first, I just want to say thank you for the lecture, and I wanted to know a bit more about the male menstruation, because I too winced a little when you were telling that story, but I was wondering why exactly they were cutting their ears and their other parts of their bodies.
Right. Well, I did write a whole book on it. My book, Blood Relations, is very largely about that. But the thing is that, yes, wherever you have a male secret cult, it invariably involves men cutting themselves and bleeding. It's like the kind of, I mean, we have all kind of sort of cliches about sort of blood brotherhood, I suppose, you know, mixing your wrists. Bleeding is, of course, a costly signal. You know, you wouldn't do it if you didn't mean it. It's not like a sort of cheap tattoo that you can, you know, you can just take put on and wash off again. Cutting yourself in that way is a costly signal of commitment. But it's true that wherever you have a male monopoly of ritual power and the men say we stole these things from women, I don't necessarily believe the story as a story about history, but what I say is these men know what they're talking about. They're menstruating, they're giving birth, but it can't be real. So when they say we stole these things from women, the reason I believe them is because in these rituals, they're still doing it. What they're stealing from women is not the actual menstruation or the actual childbirth, but the symbolic potency of menstruation and childbirth. So women do the menstruation, they do the childbearing, they do all the and the breastfeeding, but in these male cults, all the symbolic power of those things men take to themselves. And the only reason they can claim to rule is by claiming that they menstruate in a better way than women. And last week I did a talk on the ultimate roots, the deepest roots of monarchy. And I quoted from Sir James Fraser in The Golden Bough, where he points out that the very same ritual treatment that applies to menstruating girls across the world, that the sun must not shine on their head, their feet must not touch the ground, those same taboos and rules are also applied to divine kings, emperors, the Mikado of Japan, all these, and the idea is that, you know, menstruation is clearly cyclical, it's linked with the moon, linked with fertility, of course, and when those same potencies are transferred to men have to prove that they're qualified to rule by menstruating, by claiming to give birth to children. And this idea of birth to children, it's familiar to us in Christianity. You know, we all have to be twice born. A woman gives birth to the actual flesh, but until you're dunked in by a priest in a font with the water, or until you've been circumcised or whatever it is, until some males in a male cult really have rebirthed you, you haven't got a soul. I mean, we're all familiar with that. So the idea, what I'm arguing with you is that the reason why men menstruate is because that's the language of symbolic power. Women established that very long ago. So in order to claim the right to power, men have to prove that they can menstruate too, whichever way it is, ears, nose, penis, whatever.
So have we discovered what King Charles did then in terms of menstruation in all
Thank you.
Did we discuss that last week? Or did you...
Yeah, we can you say the question to?
Well, my anarchist friend,
say the question to the Zoom.
I'm doing it. I'm just leaving. I'm just saying my anarchist friend and troublemaker, June here, is asking me what kind of menstruation King Charles III is going to have to undergo. This is a troublemaker. June is always a troublemaker. What's one of the reasons I'm quite fond of her, actually.
Or you just think of yourself.
Now, so
Answer the question.
I keep getting interrupted. So, okay, I mean, when the Queen was anointed, in real life, you'll probably have seen photographs. You may have watched The Crown. I know most people know about the royal family, so you watch the fantastic television programs, The Crown. But at the moment when the priest anoints her, that's anointing her as in touch with the divine world, and she has to be invisible. She has to be visible to the celestial beings and not to ordinary mortals, which is why you never see the anointing on television, because otherwise us lot, we'd be able to see what's going on. But critically, she has to be, or he, in the case of King Charles, when he's anointed, he will have to be not his feet on the ground, and certainly no sun shining on his head. So he'll have to be on a canopy and on a stool or stepping stones, and draped in velvet. Now, I very much doubt whether he's going to have to go through anything more excruciatingly painful. But I'm just saying, symbolically, you'll find it's all there. And well, Kim has asked me to reference last week's lecture. Okay, last week's lecture was about Oni soit qui mal y pense. that's the the order of the Garter. It's a sort of secret cabal around our monarch, and on the what is it? Yeah, the royal coat of arms. You have this lion, this unicorn, this round sort of hole, which we know from the Cluny tapestries is clearly a woman whose vagina is, Camilla has another word beginning with C, is clearly that hole. And the critical thing is Oniswaki Malipans is a story. Camilla, you tell the story. It's about
Can you say what that other word is? I'm not sure.
Oniswaki.
Cunt.
Oh, are you talking about cunt? What, the
Yep,
juicy
Camilla.
luscious?
So in the middle of the royal
Right.
coat of arms, there is a big fat cunt. It's like the Shillinagig with the two animals
I'm
either
very
side.
familiar with she is.
Very similar to that. So the royal coat of arms is basically Shillinagig with this,
Oh, is it?
so with the cunt edged by this mumbo jumbo motto, Oniswaki Malipans. So the origins, it means evil be to him who thinks it. But let's tell the origin story. So it was supposedly the time of Edward III. He was dancing with a woman who was really his his cousin, and who later became his daughter-in-law, who was all a bit incestuous and dodgy. And her garter slipped down, and he reaches to, everyone's laughing at this, and he reaches to pick it up and then says these magic words, Oniswaki Malipans, evil be to him who thinks it. And he also says, you may be laughing now, but later you'll be proud to wear it. So we then think, well, what is this it actually? Is it a garter or what is it? Is it a menstrual cloth? Because the king's proximity to menstruation, it comes up again and again in myths in Africa. It comes up again and again in European. It's all a
And it's a
royal.
red garter, isn't it?
Well, the order of the garter shows like sky blue, but that's the outside meaning that we see. Inside, I'm sure it's a different color. If you think of the Virgin Mary, the coloration is like that. The icon of Virgin Mary is this sky blue outside, but inside the power is this deep red power. So it's a very similar kind of idea. Isn't it?
Okay, well done. Thank you, Camilla. Thank you.
She likes to say the word, doesn't she?
Mm,
Sorry,
recently, just in the last.
somebody's talking. Ian, did you want to say something?
No, sorry.
Okay. And Eleanor, I'm talking to Eleanor Moriki. You were telling me something last week that the Order of the Garter, the date of its founding, actually fell on a dark moon. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, there are all those internet apps. You can take the date
Of the moon.
and find what date, what's you say, what
Yeah.
part of the cycle it is. And if you go to Wikipedia, it says that the original date is this. I can't remember now. And if you run it,
1344.
yeah, it
Yeah.
was the
It
dark.
actually falls on right on a dark moon, which is pretty extraordinary.
So, I mean, just on the question of dark moon and full moon, okay, it's just one of the,
When is it tonight? Tonight?
sorry?
It's
It's a new
it's a
moon.
young new moon. It's just
So,
Sunday was new moon.
Tonight.
Sorry? Can you just, I'm sorry, but if everyone did that, we just couldn't have a class, honestly. If everyone was, every thought that came into their heads that came out of their mouths, we would have a class. So everyone's heard of the idea of the moon in June, honeymoon, full moon. Full moon is a time for lovemaking. And therefore, when you think about the cycle, it's clearly the time which in some sort of ideal pattern would be the time of ovulation. Would be menstruation occurs at dark moon. There's all kinds of reasons why it's that way around, not the other way around. So in no culture that I'm aware of is it considered to be that kind of the ideal for women to menstruate at full moon, simply because full moon is the safe time to travel. The lions are kind of not interested because they can be seen, and you want to be ovulating in order to get pregnant. Clearly, at a time when the two sexes can join up. Dark moon is a different time. Everyone's going to be seeking safety in numbers, gathered together, possibly kin-related people gathered together. And all I'm saying is that the sort of the ritual pattern, the normative pattern is ovulation at full moon, menstruation at dark moon all over the world, and certainly in myths and fairy tales. So if it's a full moon and there's suddenly an eclipse, that's a rather bad omen for a wedding, for example, because we know from all kinds of reports that if there is a full moon in these many traditional cultures and suddenly there's an eclipse, so that's a dark moon in the middle of a full moon, and everyone has to empty the pots because the idea is that it'll be full of blood, and the meat won't be cooked and all those things. So that's just the mythological pattern, and it's just so interesting if it's true, as Eleanor Muriki is suggesting, that the Order of the Garter was actually founded at new moon. It just confirms the pattern.
Yeah, we will be hearing probably more on that next week, but especially in 2 weeks' time, when Ian Watts is going to be looking at some Hadza stories, and we'll probably be looking at the relevance of the lunar, what we call syntax, the structure of myths and stories. Have we got any more questions in the room? Discussion, yes. So say that again for the Zoom people.
You're saying, I couldn't quite hear the first part of your sentence, the question.
So I guess the question is, would you describe modern society as patriarchal?
Oh, would I describe modern society as patriarchy? Well, all of the world's religions, the religions of the book, doesn't matter what it is. It could be Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Islam, Christianity. They're all deeply patriarchal religions, right from the top to bottom, patriarchy, patriarchy, patriarchy. Now, of course, you can argue that maybe these days religion doesn't play quite such a part. But, and of course, these days there's been huge resistance to patriarchy, and women have gained enormous levels of autonomy and freedom and rights in recent years. Even though compared with many African societies, traditional African societies, the gains which women have made in Europe and in America actually aren't anywhere near the traditional solidarity and power that women in Africa have had for a very long time. I have to stress that.
Na budúce, keď budem mať Kamilu, už máš 11,5 roka, vieš, sa potrebuješ do školy baviť, nepotrebuješ odo mňa rozkaz.
Is that
It's Elena.
We got somebody in Athens.
Sorry, go on. No,
sorry.
it's not Elena. It's Elena.
Oh, somebody. Okay. So okay.
Yeah,
well, I mean, the short answer is I don't know what you think. I think, to me, this is a very deeply patriarchal society. Yes, despite all the gains which women have made.
But I guess there's an argument that in today's modern society, that richness in power and the people who seem to be empowered, that the way you look at where actual power is held, there is an argument that is maybe for.
That's a very, very important point, and a very important distinction that anthropologists need to make, perhaps more than they do. That you certainly often get the sort of theoretical, public, symbolic power of men, which is completely undermined with what actually happens, particularly obviously in street life, domestic life, and so on, where women have a lot of kind of unrecognized power under the radar. So that's a very important point. But still, I mean, if the society is one where, in order to get ahead, you have to sort of either pretend you're not a woman, or wear power suits, or maybe delay having children, or all these various things which men don't have to do. And I would say as well that the point I made at the end there, that women in our society can certainly do all sorts of things, be executives and almost everything these days, really, including join the army and so on. But somehow, is it thanks to being female that you have those roles, or is it sort of despite being female? And I think for men, it's kind of thanks to having a testicle and a penis in male biology that you could do all these things. Whereas women, you can do all those things, but it's sort of at the cost of so much that's part of being female, including having children, of course. So not good. Whereas in the societies I think we evolved with, and that Mona Finnegan's described as communism in motion, and that Camilla will be talking about, the reason why women have power is because they're women. Because having a cycle connects you up with each other, you can synchronize your cycles, you can connect with the moon, huge amounts of solidarity involved in all that. And it's from solidarity that power comes.
Okay, just to say to Zoom was asking for the repeat of the question, just to say that that was an observation that perhaps what appears to be very much patriarchal society, there may be women may have a lot more hidden or under the radar powers than we think, and there could be a lot of truth there to that. We've got a question here. Can you raise your voice?
Thank you for your lecture. Regarding my question, I'm not doing language user, so you mentioned quite a lot about matriarchy. Is there any legal grounds, I would say, possible with this culture? Is there any place in our society?
Okay, the question is, I've mentioned matriarchy and I've mentioned patriarchy, but is there any middle ground somewhere between matriarchy and patriarchy? And I didn't spend enough time on it, but I absolutely agree with I think the point behind your question, which is that ideally we would all be happiest with neither one of those really. Possibly matriarchy would be less violent, less warlike, less divisive than matriarchy. But my own view is that where women have power, they don't do the kinds of things that men do when they have power, when men have power. So what I'm definitely arguing is that this concept called communism in motion, which was invented by Mona Finnegan on the basis of her fieldwork with the Benjeli, the people that we're going to be hearing a lot more about, means that women rule, then men rule, then women rule, then men rule. And the rule is kind of playful. Women playfully, jokingly, but quite forcefully take over the whole campsite, kind of scare away the boys, insult the men with all kinds of sexual provocations, prove that they're on top, thanks to being female. But they get a little bit tired of it after a while. Okay, why don't we, we've made our point, let's settle down a bit and let's give the men a chance. And then the men do their patriarchal thing, their Ejengi ritual, which is all muscles and stomping about, being powerful men, warriors, if not exactly warriors, but certainly good hunters. But again, that only lasts for about 2 weeks at the maximum, probably less than 2 weeks. So the middle ground that you're talking about will be a pendulum, an oscillation. And my own view is that all the evidence indicates that that's how we were for the large part of our evolutionary past. We were neither one nor the other. And it's like you almost only need to establish matriarchy as a sort of fixed system in a world surrounded by patriarchy. The Minoan Cretes all around them with these patriarchal societies, and the matriarchal society must have been finding it quite difficult to hold its end up against these patriarchal all around. Probably for them to risk surrendering power to men would have been a risk too far. So to have this pendulum, you need to be very confident and safe. No women should surrender power if they think that's it. They would only have surrendered power if they were pretty damn confident. Next dark moon, we'll be back on that picket line again, back expressing our solidarity again, and that enables you to relax and playfully, give way, playfully surrender, knowing that it'll be your turn again next new moon. You can certainly argue. That's what the whole.
Sorry,
okay, so our questioner wants to argue with that. That's great.
Yes, biologically genders are different. Men cannot give the birth,
Yeah.
women doesn't, and another thing that affects our life, the way we have to.
Yeah. So what? Sorry, the question is saying they can't have a pendulum because men can't give birth. Only women can give birth. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, of course.
Yes, what I'm trying to say that you said that women can take men's way of living, if I got it right, men can take women's way of living. But how about giving birth?
Well, I mean, right across Aboriginal Australia, men menstruate and give birth. I mean, I'm talking about traditional Aboriginal Australia. Men, it's called subincision. The men get initiated by having their penis cut when they're small, and then what happens is that initiation is a rebirth. Now, of course, you could say it's not true. Men don't really give birth; they don't really menstruate, but they certainly do a very good imitation of it. Now, I'm not saying at all that that's original, but what I'm saying something much more like what happens with the hunter-gatherers in the Congo, the Benjeli, would be original. And it's true that when the women are practicing their Ngoku, you could argue that they're masculinized. They're acting as sort of warriors. They're being very assertive and quite provocatively sexual and aggressive. But when men are performing their ajengi, no, they don't give birth, but they do kill animals. And in all these cultures, there's a kind of equivalence and opposition between two forms of shedding blood. Men shed blood by killing animals, and that's a kind of productive activity because the meat comes back to the camp and it's consumed. And women shed blood through menstruation and childbirth. And there's always a critical idea that when you shed blood, that establishes your sacredness. Your blood is held to be sacred, and that has another effect, which means that when men kill animals and they bleed, their blood makes the animals sacred, which means you mustn't abuse them, you mustn't laugh at them. There's a whole thing about blood, thunder, and the mockery of animals. Don't laugh at the animals that you'll be killing. And also it means that the blood in the meat makes that meat inedible until the flesh has been cooked. And then the proof that that flesh is cooked is that you look at it, is there any blood in that meat? If the blood's still there, you have to put it back in the fire to cook it. And there's a parallel between the menstrual blood and that blood of the hunt. So men don't have to be really giving birth or menstruating, and don't even need to pretend in that culture, because they kill animals, and that's their job.
So, can I ask you about that last point?
Yeah, there's a person there, but this person. Go.
From my understanding, there's this idea that capitalism, like the ownership of land, a man owning his own land and his own assets and his family, is what brought about the patriarchal society. So is there an idea that capitalism and patriarchal society can't coexist, and that's why we refer to a patriarchal society and patriarchal? Like, is it that ownership of land, that business, and that those corporations that make men seem more dominant than women, like overtly in our society?
Yes, okay. The question is, am I arguing that there's something about capitalism which is incompatible with matriarchy? And when you have capitalism, am I arguing that you're going to get patriarchy? Because really,
Is that a view in Africa?
Is it a view? Okay, I mean, obviously, we all have slightly different views and sometimes very different views, but I think there's a widespread consensus that with the development of property ownership, so with egalitarian hunter-gatherers, no man can accumulate any wealth, because as he kills the animals, he has to surrender those animals to his in-laws, otherwise he's not going to get any sex. So if you want sex, you better be very generous and modest and keep surrendering those animals. Accumulation is impossible. But when you get farming, and in a different way, when you get cattle ownership, pastoralism, that begins to change. The word capitalism comes from capital, which means head, and originally that's a head of cattle. It's if you like, a cow's head. So as you accumulate capital, originally that would have been accumulating cattle, and with all these cattle, you can give those to your in-laws and take away the woman. And Marx argued the very first form of private property was a man's ownership of a wife in monogamous marriage. I think there's a lot to be said for that argument, that when women kind of belong to a man, when she no longer has sexual rights, when she can't be raped because she said yes at the time she was married. So rape within marriage is not even a possible concept because you're his wife, so therefore you must give him sex. All those things, I know. All those things would mean that yes, that there's a conflict there. Is under capitalism, would it be possible to have a gender egalitarian society? It's too big a question. Things would have to change very, very profoundly. And
affluence, wouldn't it?
Yes, that's right. Affluence would enable it. But what would be a condition would be sufficient affluence for all of us to be able to go on strike half the month, to have a period of, instead of just a weekend off or just Sunday off or carnival off. Can you? Yeah, okay.
Right, I'm going to take 2 more questions. I've got one on Zoom, unless there's any other in the room. June, did you want to have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to clarify something about the Ben Jelly that you said. You're saying that the men kill animals, so their sacred right is, the blood right is killing animals. So you're saying that those type of groups don't do the false menstruation thing because they don't need to?
Yeah.
That's right.
That's
okay. So okay on Zoom. Stephen, you want one? And
yes.
I'm going to
Can
Zoom.
I ask you to take a punt on the future, please, about matriarchy, with the coming of which we all rejoice in. At the moment, the facts are we have 2 men playing higher and higher with nuclear bombs, and where women get by ability into working places and that, they rather prefer that to having children, so that in Europe, the birth rate is plummeting. How do you see that squaring out, please?
I've been asked to talk about the future. Well, I suppose the simplest way to say that is that men have been running things for what, 5,000 years, 7,000 years, obviously it depends where you're talking about. And they've been making a right mess of things. And that huge mess has never been worse than it is today. And my own view is that revolution is looking pretty precarious and perhaps even unlikely. As a scientist, I'm aware we have looked as if have we passed the tipping point of climate catastrophe? Are we just approaching it? Did we pass it like 10 years ago? I mean, it's really very, very worrying whether we'll even have a planet that's not being burnt up, if you like, by patriarchy. So I suppose what I would say is it's either we have a revolution or it's kind of curtains for all of us. That's my own view. It's maybe a bit of a pessimistic view because revolution isn't looking too happy right now. But then I'd add to that a revolution not led by women would be absolutely useless. A revolution which is led by men, but ending up with more of these wretched men who are abusing their power, wouldn't be a revolution. A proper revolution would have to be a repetition on a higher level of the revolution which made us human. It was the human revolution, was a turning upside down of everything, turning in particular male dominance on its head, and leading to a situation of what we call communism in motion, where women rule, men rule, women rule, men rule, but starting, of course, with a kind of reverse dominance. So, I mean, I've been asked to say, what do I think about the future? I just think we better get our act together because there won't be a future if we don't.
Leon asked no, Lockie, you wanted another question, and then Eleanor Moriki, or is that Ian would have one? Yeah. So 2 more. Lockie?
Yes, my question was a little bit about if we are more omnivores or more herbivores than we thought, how does that change, if any, men's place in society when actually we're not maybe killing as many animals or before, if we were eating a lot more vegetables and fruit?
Okay.
Well, I mean, Okay, I mean, there's different ways of addressing that issue, but among hunter-gatherers, the greatest levels of gender egalitarianism, the greatest levels of female collective power are in those societies where there's greatest abundance of game animals. So when there's, like in Africa, where until very recently you had giraffe and zebra and wildebeest and eland, plentiful game animals, it just meant that men could slow down the hunt, go a major hunt, get enough meat to survive for quite a while, and didn't have to sort of scrabble around all the time, to get their food. So actually, abundance of game animals is one of the conditions for women's relative egalitarianism among hunter-gatherers. It's where the meat gets scarce that men increasingly have to depend on women's labor. I wouldn't go into it. I just say I think hunting was a critical part of human evolution. I don't believe that the sort of one-sided woman, the gatherer, who cares about meat? Women just gather food. Now, I'm strongly on the meat side of these things. I should add that I am personally a vegetarian. I have been since 1984.
The last question, Ian, you want to talk?
Yes, it was just coming back on June's last question, and sort of more. It's not a question. It's more of a point of clarification about the Mbengeli, where Chris was sort of saying that it's men's hunting that is that's how he addressed June's question. But in fact, the Ijengi ritual, the masked spirit, represents a male initiation ritual in which the mothers surrender their male offspring and they die and are resurrected. So in that sense, it is just like in Australia.
To some extent it's like in Australia, but
it's nothing like as bloody, it's nothing like as painful, but it is comparable.
Yes, I mean, the Mbengeli have a story that a Jengi, this is sort of...
We're going to hear about this from Jerome Lewis.
Okay, well,
can I say, because we're going to have to wind up, and this is opening a whole new arena. Jerome Lewis will be talking later in the term on a Mbengeli ritual of Ijengi and Ngoku, I hope. The talk titled Women's Biggest Husband is the Moon, early December, I think. So we can say a lot more about this. We've had an awful lot packed in tonight, and I just want to say, well, thank you to everybody on Zoom, and we are going to wave goodbye to you, and then I'm going to talk to the people in the class. So next week, I'm going to talk on the world's first picket line. So that is going to be about the human revolution directly. So I hope everybody on Zoom, you're going to be coming back for that. And I'm going to say goodbye to you and thank you very much for your coming in. It's great to have you and see you there.